They laughed when I backed a live fish truck up to my dying cornfield in the summer of 2019, and I want you to picture it exactly the way Dale Pruitt saw it that morning, standing by his county truck with his clipboard. Because I was 29 years old, I had $1,100 left in my account, and I was about to pour 4,000 gallons of water crawling with paddlefish across land the bank said wasn't worth the seed. If you've ever stood on ground that used to belong to someone you loved and watched everyone around you wait for you to fail, tell me where you're watching this from, and hit like and subscribe before the numbers come in, because you already know how this ends for the man in the good shoes. Loop 1 starts with a folder on Ellis Vance's desk marked Holt Parcel, Ridgeline Road, Cumberland County, and a 90-day option agreement Prairie Crest Holdings needed signed before the county's water allocation hearing in October, because without my 1,120 acres, their grain terminal contract with 3 downstream mills couldn't hit volume. Loop 2 is quieter and meaner. It's Verna Sykes leaning over her fence telling anyone who'd listen that grief had finally cracked open Ezra Holt's granddaughter, that a woman alone with a dead man's notebooks had no business running a farm that took him 47 years to build. Loop 3 is the one I carried in my chest for 3 years without telling a soul. The day would come when every person who smiled at my failure would have to stand in a room and read my numbers off a board. And I needed you to remember, when it happened, that I never asked for their apology. I only asked for their silence. And I got exactly that. My grandfather died in March of 2018, 18 months before that truck showed up, and the only things he left me outright were 1,120 acres of river-bottom ground along Cumberland Creek, a 2-story farmhouse with a porch that leaned 4 degrees east, and 19 leather ledgers going back to 1974, each one filled with his handwriting, small and slanted, recording things no agronomist ever asked him to record. Rainfall to the 10th of an inch, the day the killdeer nested, the exact week the creek silted up brown instead of running clear. He never wrote a feeling down in 19 books. He wrote what the land did, and when, and what followed after, year over year, until the pattern was so plain a child could read it, if the child had patience, which is the one thing nobody in Cumberland County had anymore. He used to stand at the edge of the North 40 with his hand flat against his hip and say the same 6 words to me every single September of my childhood. The land keeps its own books, girl. Read them before you write your own. I didn't understand him until I was 31 years old and standing in a grain elevator office with 3 men in suits waiting on my answer. The community had already decided who I was before I made a single decision as owner. At the funeral, before the dirt was even settled, 2 men from Prairie Crest Holdings stood at the edge of the reception in suits that cost more than my truck, and one of them introduced himself as Harlan Caldwell, Regional Acquisitions Director, and told me, with a sympathy card still in his coat pocket, that he understood grief made people want to hold on to things that no longer served them. He offered $2.3 million cash for the parcel, 30-day close, no contingencies, and he smiled the whole time like he was doing me a favor by naming a number instead of waiting a decent interval. I told him the land wasn't for sale. He told me every piece of land was for sale, I just didn't know my price yet, and he left his card on the porch rail like it was a gift. That was the first time. I kept the card. I have it still, in the back of Ledger 20, the one I started myself. The farmhouse still smelled like him for the first year. Cherry pipe tobacco he'd quit smoking a decade before, but never stopped keeping a tin of on the mantel, and diesel from the boots he left by the mudroom door that I couldn't make myself move. Ezra Holt ran that ground for 47 years, and before that it was his father's for 26. And the deed itself, framed crooked in the front hall, goes back to a homestead claim filed in 1911. He never remarried after my grandmother died when I was 6, never took a partner on the land, and the county always treated that as eccentric rather than admirable, the way they treat any man who keeps to himself as either a saint or a fool depending on whether his fields come in that year. I grew up 2 counties over with my mother, his daughter, and only spent summers on that ground, which is exactly why the will surprised everyone but me. He left the whole operation to a granddaughter who'd been gone 9 months out of every 12 since she was 18, working an agronomy lab job in Omaha that paid steady and asked nothing of her except competence. I quit that job on a Tuesday and moved into the farmhouse on a Thursday, and I never once told anyone in Cumberland County that I'd studied soil science formally. because letting them believe I was improvising blind made the eventual reckoning sweeter, and because Ezra's third rule, Ledger 1, inside cover, was don't hand a man the rope he needs to explain away your results. Dale Pruitt came around 11 days after the funeral, county extension agent for the last 22 years, driving the same white pickup with the seal on the door, and he stood in my kitchen turning Ezra's ledgers over in his hands like they were relics from a dead religion. He told me, not unkindly, that anecdotal field notes weren't a substitute for soil chemistry, that the university's own data showed synthetic nitrogen at 180 pounds per acre outperformed any legacy method on record, and that grief was a hard teacher but a bad agronomist. He said it with a small, patient smile, the kind men give women when they've already decided the conversation is over. I wrote his exact numbers down in a new ledger that night, page 1, because I intended to hold him to them, word for word, 3 years later. By the second spring, the corn yield on the North 40 had fallen to 61 bushels an acre, against a county average of 174, because Ezra's last 2 years were spent fighting a cancer he never told anyone about, and the ground had gone unworked and unwatched. The banknote was $410 behind. Verna Sykes told the Thursday coffee group at the Cumberland Diner that the Holt girl was going to lose the whole place inside a year, and she said it loud enough, on purpose, for it to reach me through her daughter-in-law, who worked the counter. I heard it standing outside with a box of diesel filters in my arms, the smell of number 2 fuel still on my gloves, and I didn't flinch, and I didn't answer, because Ezra's second rule, written on the inside cover of Ledger 4, was never explain yourself twice. I only had to hear a thing said about me once, to know exactly who'd said it. That same week I found the entry that changed everything, dated August the 14th, 1988, in Ledger 9. Ezra had written about a summer his own father flooded the low pasture with pond water thick with bluegill, and carp after a drought cracked the clay to fists, and how the ground that year, against every neighbor's prediction, came back greener and denser than ground fed on store-bought nitrogen, because live fish in slow water break down into exactly the kind of nitrogen and phosphorus a stressed root system can actually use, released slow, released whole, tied to organic matter that holds moisture through a dry spell, instead of leaching straight through cracked soil in the first hard rain. He'd written 6 words at the bottom of that page, underlined twice: "Fish forgive ground that men gave up on." I read that line 4 times standing in the barn with a lantern, because the bank was calling every 9 days, and I had $1,100 left after the note, the seed loan, and the fuel bill, and Harlan Caldwell's card was still sitting on my porch rail collecting dust and rain spots. I drove 210 miles to a hatchery outside Hastings and bought 4,000 gallons worth of live paddlefish and grass carp, the cold stock they couldn't sell to sport lakes, for $600, every dollar of it borrowed against a life insurance payout that hadn't even cleared yet. I rigged the old irrigation pivot to draw from a holding pond I dug myself with a rented trencher, 12 feet by 40, lined with clay I hauled from the creek bank in a stock trailer, over 6 days, alone, blistered hands, diesel and pond mud under my fingernails, so deep it took a week to scrub out. Verna Sykes drove past twice while I worked, and didn't slow down either time. Dale Pruitt did slow down, on the 11th day, when the truck pulled into the yard with its tank sloshing and fish visible through the slats, and he stood at the fence with his clipboard and told me, in front of my own hired hand, that the county couldn't in good conscience list this as an approved soil amendment practice, that I was, in his words, treating a working farm like folklore, and that he hoped I had a plan B before the bank came calling in the spring. I said nothing. I wrote his words down that night, page 11, same ledger. Tobias Rourke was the only man who didn't laugh. He'd worked 40 acres over from Ezra for 30 years before his knees gave out, and he sold off in '09, and he showed up on the 12th day unasked, with his own truck and his own gloves, and helped me run 400 feet of drip line off that holding pond without saying more than was needed. He told me once, over coffee, that Ezra had shown him the same trick back in the drought of '89, small scale, just 2 acres, and it had worked well enough that Ezra never talked about it publicly again, because a man who'd seen the county laugh at an idea once learned to keep the next one quiet. Toby wasn't loud about helping me either. He just kept showing up, Tuesdays and Fridays for the better part of 2 years, and never once asked to be thanked for it, which suited me, since I don't do that kind of thanking out loud. Dale Pruitt came back a second time that first autumn, uninvited again, this time with a printed university extension bulletin folded into thirds in his shirt pocket, and he read me 2 lines from it standing in my own driveway, something about unverified anecdotal amendment strategies posing a documented risk to nutrient runoff compliance, and he told me the county could, if it came to that, issue a compliance advisory that would follow the parcel on record. I asked him whether an advisory required a documented violation, or just his opinion of my pond. He didn't have an answer to that, and he left without writing anything, but I noticed he didn't come back again for 11 months, which told me the threat had been bigger than the substance behind it, exactly the kind of thing Ezra used to call a scarecrow with a badge on it. Verna Sykes had a second scene too. The spring the corn first came up dense and dark green on the North 40, while her own leased acreage next door was still pale and thin, from a fertilizer delivery that came late. She stood at the fence one morning while I checked the drip lines, arms crossed over her housecoat, and told me, not laughing this time, that whatever I was doing out there better not be running off into the water table and killing her well, because she'd sue a Holt same as anybody else. I told her the pond ran off surface catchment, not the shared aquifer, and that her well water was the same water it had always been. She didn't believe me, and she didn't apologize 3 years later either, not directly, but she stopped leaning over that fence after the certification board went up, and in Cumberland County, a woman going quiet is its own kind of confession. If you're still with me, that's already more patience than most people in this county gave me, so hit subscribe now, because what happened on the North 40 by the 3rd August is the part Harlan Caldwell still won't say out loud in a room with witnesses. The second Caldwell visit came 14 months after the funeral at the county fairgrounds, during the Ag Expo, where Prairie Crest had a booth with a banner 3 times my height and free coffee in branded cups. He found me at the fence line where I was watching the 4-H heifer judging, and he told me the 90-day option had lapsed but the offer stood, revised down now to $1.9 million, because the water board hearing had moved up, and Prairie Crest's contract with the mills had penalty clauses attached to volume shortfalls. He said it like a man doing me a courtesy, lowering a number and calling it patience. I told him the land still wasn't for sale, and I told him, for the first time, that I intended to be the one supplying his mills instead, which made him laugh, a short closed-mouth laugh, and he told me paddlefish ponds weren't going to feed a grain terminal contract, sweetheart, and I let him have that word, sweetheart, because I intended to make him regret it in front of an audience someday, and I did. Ellis Vance arrived that same autumn, Junior Contracts Counsel for Prairie Crest, sent to, in his own words, clean up some loose ends Harlan's office had left behind regarding easement access along Cumberland Creek. He was younger than Caldwell, sharper dressed, and he had exactly one trick, which was smiling at me like we were already colleagues, while he laid out how much simpler everyone's life would be if I granted a temporary access easement for a soil survey crew. I told him the creek access was mine, and the survey crew could stand on the county road. He came back twice more that fall with the same smile and the same request rephrased, and both times I gave him the same answer, until he stopped coming, and Toby told me later that Ellis had told the Prairie Crest office the Holt woman was, quote, unusually well informed about her own easement rights for someone running a 2-person operation, which I took, correctly, as a compliment he hadn't meant to give. By the 2nd September, the North 40 was running 69 bushels higher than the county's blended average on dry land acres. On soil the bank had written off 18 months earlier, and I still hadn't told a single neighbor the actual number, because Ezra's 4th rule, Ledger 2, page 6, was let the harvest do the talking, not your mouth. Verna Sykes told the coffee group I must be buying seed corn under the table from somewhere and cutting corners on my mortgage to hide it, because there was no other way a Holt girl outperformed men who'd farmed 40 years straight. I heard that one secondhand too, delivered by Toby, who repeated it flat and neutral because he knew better than to editorialize in front of me, and I only said one thing back, write the date down. He did. I've still got that page. The drought that broke the county came in year 3, the summer everyone still calls the dry year around Cumberland, when 6 inches of rain fell across the entire growing season against a 15-inch average, and the aquifer level under 3 of my 4 neighboring farms dropped low enough that the water board issued emergency restrictions in July, capping pivot irrigation at 40% of normal draw for anyone on the shared allocation, which was every farm on Ridgeline Road except mine, because my holding pond ran off surface creek flow and rain catchment, not the shared aquifer, a detail Ezra had written into Ledger 6 back in 1979, as though he'd known, word for word, that a day like this one was coming for whoever inherited this ground after him. Dale Pruitt's own extension bulletin that July, the one he mailed to every farm in the county, including mine, recommended reduced planting density and early harvest to salvage what synthetic-fed acres could still be saved. My acres weren't on that list, because my acres didn't need saving. I stood at the edge of the North 40 in the second week of August that year, with dust so fine it sat on my boots like flour, and for one single night, the only night in 3 years, I let myself doubt it, sitting on the tailgate with Ledger 20 open on my knee, wondering if I'd spent everything Ezra left me proving a dead man's superstition instead of running an actual farm, and I heard his voice plain as anything, not a ghost, just memory doing its job, saying the land keeps its own books. Girl, read them before you write your own. And I thought about the $1,100 and the fish truck and the blistered hands, and I got up off that tailgate, and I didn't doubt it again. That's the only night I'll admit to. I never told Toby. I'm only telling you. The county grain elevator posts yield certifications on a board by the scale house every October, right where every farmer in Cumberland comes to weigh a load, and that October, the year of the dry summer, my North 40 certified at 191 bushels an acre on non-irrigated ground, against a county blended average, drought-adjusted, of 88. Dale Pruitt was standing at that scale house when the number went up on the board, because his own office ran the certification, and he read it twice before he said anything, and what he said, in front of 4 other farmers waiting to weigh in, was that the number had to be a testing error. I told him to run it again. He did. It came back the same. Harlan Caldwell showed up 9 days later, not at the fairgrounds this time, but at my kitchen table. No banner, no branded coffee cup, and he told me Prairie Crest's mill contract had a volume shortfall penalty clause worth $400,000 coming due at the end of the quarter, because 3 of the farms they'd already bought out under the old allocation couldn't hit yield in a dry year, and the terminal needed a supplier who could guarantee tonnage regardless of aquifer restrictions. And he asked me, without a single sweetheart in his mouth this time, what it would take to put my acres under contract instead of under his acquisition list. I told him I'd think about it, and I let him sit with that for 6 full days before I called him back, because Ezra's rule about not explaining yourself twice cuts both directions, and a man who calls you sweetheart in public doesn't get an answer on his timeline. The meeting happened at the elevator office in November, boardroom windows looking straight out at the scale house, 3 Prairie Crest directors flown in from the regional office, Harlan Caldwell, Ellis Vance taking notes, and Dale Pruitt invited by the county to speak to the certification numbers, because by then the story had crossed the county line, and 2 agricultural papers wanted comment. I walked in with Ledger 20 and the original certification printout, and I laid out terms instead of an answer, a 5-year supply contract at $4.10 a bushel above spot, drought year floor pricing locked regardless of water board restrictions, and full public acknowledgement, printed in both papers, that the yield had been achieved without the aquifer draw every other Prairie Crest supplier depended on. Harlan Caldwell signed it in 11 minutes, and I remember the sound of his pen on that boardroom table more clearly than I remember most of the rest of that year. A small dry click against the wood grain, because his hand was shaking just slightly, and he pressed too hard on the first line. One of the flown-in directors, a man named Whitcomb who never gave his first name, asked before the signature went down whether the county could independently re-verify the certification, since $400,000 in penalty exposure wasn't a number his board would accept on a handshake, and the elevator's own scale manager pulled the original weigh tickets right there at the table, date-stamped, witness initialed by 2 other farmers who'd been standing at that scale house in October. Dale Pruitt, asked directly by Whitcomb whether the method had scientific merit, sat with that folded extension bulletin still creased in his jacket pocket for a full 10 seconds before he answered, and what he said, in front of everyone in that room, in front of Ellis Vance's open notepad was that the data spoke for itself, which was the closest thing to an apology I ever got out of him, and I let it stand exactly as it was, because I never needed him to say sorry. I only needed him to say true, on the record, where 4 other people could hear it and repeat it. Verna Sykes sold her place 2 years after that to a couple from Lincoln who wanted a hobby orchard, and the last thing she said to Toby before the closing, which he repeated to me word for word because he knew I'd want it exact, was that she supposed some people just get lucky with dirt. I let her have that one too. Ellis Vance left Prairie Crest within the year for a firm downstate, and the last contract renewal I signed went through a woman named Ruth Okafor instead, who read every clause I put in front of her without a single smile that wasn't earned. Harlan Caldwell still calls every March to check on planting, and I still let the call go to voicemail twice before I pick up the 3rd time, because some habits I keep on purpose. Dale Pruitt retired from the extension office 4 years after that boardroom meeting, quietly, without the send-off dinner the county usually throws for a man with 20-some years of service, and I heard from Toby that his replacement, a younger agent named Priya Nair, drove out to the north 40 her first month on the job, and asked to walk the pond line herself instead of reading it off a file, which is the only kind of apology this county ever actually pays forward, one generation deciding to look instead of assume. I've since become, without ever asking for the title, the person 3 counties call when a drought year turns ugly and somebody's aquifer runs dry, and I tell every one of them the same 6 words Ezra told me, because they're the only advice I've ever found that holds up in every kind of weather. I never sold the method, never franchised it, never let a agribusiness consultant put a brand name on it and charge farmers a licensing fee to hear what a dead man wrote down for free in 1988, because the day I turn Ezra's ledgers into a product is the day I become Harlan Caldwell in a different pair of boots, and I did not spend 3 years proving I wasn't for sale, just to sell the proof itself. The paddlefish pond is 4 times the size it was that first summer now, feeding 600 acres instead of 40, and I've filled 11 ledgers of my own since ledger 20, each one in my own hand, small and slanted the way his was, recording rainfall to the 1/10 of an inch, and the week the killdeer nest, and the year the creek ran brown instead of clear, because the pattern only holds if somebody keeps writing it down after the first person who noticed it is gone. Toby's granddaughter Meredith works the pond rotation with me now on weekends, 17 years old, sharper with a shovel than most grown men I've hired, and last month I handed her ledger one, Ezra's, the real first one, 1974, and told her the same 6 words he told me at the edge of that same field, 30 years before I understood them. The land keeps its own books, girl. Read them before you write your own. She asked me how long it takes before you stop needing someone else's ledgers and start trusting your own. I told her the truth, which is that I still don't fully know, 3 decades of entries in, and neither did he, and maybe that not knowing is the actual inheritance, more than the acres or the pond or the contract ever was. I showed her the page from Ledger 9, August 14, 1988, the one with fish forgive ground that men gave up on underlined twice in Ezra's own hand, and I told her that line had cost me $1,100 and 3 years of being laughed at behind a diner counter before it ever earned me a single cent, and that she should expect the exact same slow, humiliating math to apply to whatever she eventually writes down that absolutely nobody else believes yet. What would you do, the 1 year everyone around you is certain you've already lost, if the only proof you had left was a dead man's handwriting and 4,000 gallons of fish nobody else wanted? Because next time I'm going to tell you about the winter the bank tried to call the note anyway, contract or not, and what Ruth Okafor did the morning she found out about it before I did. And if you've made it this far with me, through the dry year and the scale house, and Harlan Caldwell's 11 minutes, you already know you're not clicking away now. So go ahead and hit subscribe, since you've already proven you're exactly the kind of person who finishes what they start.